Okay.
Go ahead and say hi to Makiba.
Hi, Makiba.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good morning, Makiba. This is Scott.
Good morning. Recent trends have given carbohydrates, particularly sugars, a bad reputation. As a result, some athletes and even non-athletes avoid carbohydrates and sugar, even though the benefits for athletic performance are well documented. Joining me today to shed more light on these trends and to talk about sports nutrition and how carbohydrates benefit athletes is Women's Soccer Hall of Famer Judy Foudy. Julie is former captain of the U.S. women's national team and one of the most accomplished female soccer players in the world. She played for the U.S. women's national soccer team from 1987 to 2004 and is currently an analyst and reporter for ABC and ESPN. Julie is joined today by sports dietitian Scott Sennard. Good morning, Julie and Scott. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank
Good
you.
morning.
Now, first, Julie, can you share some of your career highlights with us and how a fitness plan, including carbohydrates, helped to achieve those highlights?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, looking back, I played for a long time on the U.S. team, and it's hard to pick one moment, but I would probably say my career highlight was the '99 World Cup because it was right here in the United States. On home soil, we were, of course, able to win it, which is always nice. So I think that's probably one of the highlights of my career. And when you mentioned, the carbohydrates in the form of sugar, one of the things Scott and I are really passionate about, not just as athletes, but as parents as well, is this debate out there about sugar and just recognizing that not all sugars are bad. And for athletes, coupled with activity and the appropriate amounts, that carbohydrates in the form of sugar actually are needed for fuel. And Scott, of course, can talk to the science of that, but they're needed for fuel so that they can help performance for athletes.
Yeah, carbohydrates in the form of sugar are the fuel source for high-intensity activity. I often use the analogy of NASCAR, and those stock cars run at 8,000 and 9,000 RPMs for 500 miles, and they have to win a race. Athletes are not very different. They have to go at a high intensity for a long period of time so that they're trained for their competition, so that they can pull away from a defender. And to be able to train like that, they need the fuel source. And the fuel source for athletes at high intensities for longer durations that are over an hour, it's going to be carbohydrates in the form of sugar. They could go down in the intensity of their activity. That's not going to help them win. And going down in the intensity uses different fuels, but that's where, again, we want to keep the intensity high. And at high intensity, carbohydrates are that fuel source.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Julie, you are the best of the best, a world-class athlete. Can you please share with us some of your personal training tips as well as advice on how you refuel during physical activity?
Personal training tips, I think, is obviously keeping that balance, right? And in terms of nutrition, and again, Scott would be the best person to talk about the diets, but one of the things I know worked well for me is that you have to have a balance of proteins, of carbohydrates. And for athletes, in terms of a lot of people say, oh, should I have the pasta the night before? I absolutely had pasta the night before. And in terms of how many hours in front of your competition you should be eating, we usually ate about 3 to 4 hours ahead of time. But really the thing I think that gets lost in that conversation is sometimes people try and cut all of that out, cut sugars out entirely. And that's where we have been trying to reassure parents and active athletes that, coupled with exercise and 60 minutes of intense exercise, and of course in the appropriate amounts. And in sports drinks like Gatorade, they've had 50 years of science that backs why they put it in there. They put it in there for a purpose. And so those are the things I think that really can enhance when you're in that 75th minute of a soccer game. You need that energy, and that's going to be your fuel source, and not to forget that as an athlete.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Scott, you earlier talked about how carbohydrates benefit athletes, and that's definitely beneficial for parents to pass down to their children. Can you also share with us how do carbohydrates positively affect the person who has a busy lifestyle? So, for example, that mom who's attending that soccer game for their child.
Well, sure. Carbohydrates have sort of three main functions that they help people with, mostly athletes, but certainly with people. It is a fuel source for that high intensity activity. So again, moms are busy, there's no question. I know Julie is, I know my wife is very busy. And probably what's the better thing for them that carbohydrates does is it fuels your brain. It helps keep you sharp, it helps with decision making, but again, that translates certainly onto the field as well. And that word carbohydrates, if you think about the last half of it, they help keep you hydrated. And so, you know, the water kind of just flows with carbs into the muscle, and those are important things for day-to-day performance and then athletic performance as well.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing, Scott, just wanted to ask you in terms of carbohydrates and the trend, like you said, of avoiding them altogether. What words of wisdom would you give to that parent who has that scholar athlete in their home and they're trying to take that route of eliminating the carbohydrates for their child because they're following this trend? What words of wisdom would you give them?
Well, sure. I would love to just reassure them that to know that when their athlete is going at a high intensity for more than an hour, they have burned almost entirely carbohydrate. And again, when it's at that state in your body, it's a carbohydrate in the form of sugar. And it's something that their body needs. And so honestly, to not get too sciencey, but if they don't provide that carbohydrate, your muscles are going to break down and actually turn into carbs and sugar so your muscles can then use them. You're trying to build your muscles up during that training. So providing the carbs in the form of sugar help that muscle build up so that they're better off when it comes game day on down the road.
That's great advice. And lastly, where can people go for more information?
Sure, if you just search on the internet, Gatorade Sports Science Institute or the Australian Institute for Sport. On the Australian Institute for Sports website, there's a nutrition page that has different sports and different nutrients of carbs, proteins, and fats. Same thing would go with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute's website. A lot of good information across all boards of nutrition and across all sports.
Okay, great. Now, remember that when it comes to keeping your body properly fueled during physical activity, you do not want to count carbohydrates out of your regimen. In fact, carbohydrates and or sugars can improve endurance capacity and performance, not just in sports, but in everyday activity. To learn more about the benefits of carbohydrates to your fitness plan, be sure to visit the Gatorade Sports and Science website, and I'll have that listed on the site below this interview. Thank you so much again, Julie and Scott, for joining me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.